The email was only 9 words long. Stop asking for help. You're on your own. Patricia Pat. Walker stared at the screen until the glow blurred. Outside her condo window, Phoenix was already warming up, the early sky turning pale over stucco roofs and gravel yards. A ceiling fan clicked as it spun. Her phone sat beside her coffee mug, silent for the first time in weeks. She did not type a paragraph back. She did not call to beg. She did not ask what she did wrong. She replied with one word, "Understood." Then she did something most people never do when family turns cruel. Pat printed the email. She placed it on her kitchen table like evidence. She pulled a folder from a drawer and wrote one word on the tab in thick black marker: documentation. Before the sun finished climbing, she was already in her car, driving through heat shimmer and morning traffic toward the nearest Wells Fargo branch. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her face looked calm, but her stomach felt like it was holding a stone. Because Pat wasn't just hurt. Pat suspected she had been used. For months, her son Kyle and his girlfriend Brianna had called with emergencies that never lasted long enough to be verified. Ambulances that were on the way. Hospital admissions that needed a deposit right now. A medical hold that required cash today or they won't treat him. Always urgent. Always terrifying. Always money. And always a new warning from Kyle afterward, said like a scolding, "Mom, you're vulnerable to scams." Pat had taught 7th graders for decades. She knew what a pattern looked like. She knew what manipulation sounded like. She also knew the dangerous thing about guilt. It can make smart people act desperate. But guilt was no longer driving. Proof was. In this story, a 69-year-old retired teacher tracks every payment, every receipt, every excuse. She turns a kitchen table into an investigation board. She hires a quiet accountant who asks the right questions. She builds a partial, irrevocable trust that shuts the door Kyle thought was always open. And when the threats come, when Kyle tries to label her confused and pushes for a psychiatric evaluation, Pat walks into a formal room with a printed spreadsheet, bank receipts, and a registered letter that changes everything. If Pat is the kind of person you respect, tap like, subscribe, and stay until the end, because the final proof is not what anyone expects. And while the story unfolds, comment the city and state you're listening from. It helps show how far Pat's voice travels. Because in Phoenix, Arizona, where heat exposes cracks in concrete, Pat is about to expose something worse in her own family. Pat Walker's day started before the neighborhood woke up. At 5:45 a.m., just while Phoenix still held a thin layer of cool air, she rolled out a yoga mat in her living room. The blinds were half open, letting in a blue-gray dawn. A framed photo of Kyle at age 8 sat on a shelf, his teeth too big for his smile. Pat glanced at it the way people glance at a clock, out of habit, not comfort. She moved through slow stretches with practiced care. Years of teaching had left her with stiff shoulders and a lower back that complained if she ignored it. She breathed steady, counted quietly, and finished with a long forward fold. Then she made coffee, fed the small desert plant on her windowsill, and checked her calendar on paper, not an app. Pat was organized by nature. Even retired, she lived like someone who expected life to give a pop quiz. At 7:10 a.m., she drove herself to the senior center for a beginner yoga class she helped lead twice a week. The building sat behind a line of palms and a cracked parking lot that shimmered by mid-morning. Inside, it smelled like lemon cleaner and old books. Pat greeted the front desk volunteer by name, waved at a couple playing cards, and carried a tote bag filled with resistance bands and printed handouts. People liked Pat, not because she was loud, but because she was consistent. She showed up. She listened. She remembered details. She was the kind of person who brought extra water bottles in the summer and kept a spare phone charger in her glove box. That mattered in Phoenix, where extreme heat could turn small problems into emergencies fast. For most of her life, Pat's reliability had been her identity. As a mother, it became her weakness. Kyle was 35 now, grown, confident, and very good at speaking like a man who knew better than everyone else. He had moved around the valley chasing jobs that never seemed to last long. Sales, consulting, a short stint at a startup, then something he called market analysis. Pat understood teaching. She understood lesson plans, budgets, and the way people lied with half-truths. She did not understand Kyle's life. After her divorce, Pat had made one promise to herself. Kyle would never feel abandoned the way she had. She worked extra tutoring jobs, clipped coupons, skipped vacations. When Kyle needed a car at 16, she found a reliable used sedan and paid the insurance herself for 2 years. When he wanted community college, she helped with tuition. When he needed a reset at 28, she let him sleep on her couch for 3 months. Pat told herself that was love. Somewhere along the way, it turned into a habit, one Kyle depended on. It started, as these things often do, with just this once. 2 months earlier, in early May, Pat had been at the senior center when her phone buzzed with Kyle's name. He almost never called during business hours. That was the first odd detail. When she stepped into the hallway and answered, Kyle sounded breathless. "Mom, don't panic," he said. The phrase was supposed to calm her. It did the opposite. "What happened?" "It's Brianna," Kyle said. "She's at urgent care. They think it's her appendix. They said she might need surgery, but they need a deposit before they do anything else." "It's insane." Pat's mind snapped to images. Fluorescent lights, gurneys, paperwork, someone vomiting into a plastic basin. Her chest tightened. "Where are you?" she asked. "I'm here with her," Kyle said quickly. "It's a Banner Health clinic. Look, I can't read everything right now. There's a lot going on. Can you just send something, like 2,000? We'll pay you back, I swear." The number hit hard. $2,000 was not life-ending, but it wasn't casual money either. Pat lived on her pension and Social Security, plus a small retirement account she guarded like a fragile heirloom. Still, it was her son. It was urgent care. It was the word surgery. She asked, "Can I talk to her?" "She's in pain, Mom," Kyle snapped, then softened. "Please, you know I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious." Pat sent the money, not because she was naive, but because fear can erase logic in seconds. A week later, Brianna was fine. There was no scar. There were no follow-up appointments. When Pat asked what the doctor said, Kyle became defensive. "Mom, you're starting to sound paranoid," he told her. "You know there are scams everywhere. You need to be careful. You're vulnerable to scams." The words stung, especially because he said them like he cared. Pat swallowed her questions and tried to laugh it off. She told herself it was awkward, not suspicious. She told herself she was overreacting. Then it happened again. A medical emergency turned into a temporary hold. A late-night call became a frantic request for just $500 until morning. A text message arrived with a blurry photo of a hospital bracelet, cropped so tight it could have been anyone's wrist. Each time, Kyle used the same tactic: urgency first, criticism afterward. "Mom, you can't keep interrogating," he said one evening when Pat asked for a discharge summary. "That's how people get scammed. You need to trust your own son." Pat hated herself for how relieved she felt when he said son. It made her feel needed. But relief didn't last. Little cracks started appearing in places Pat couldn't ignore. Kyle would forget the names of nurses. He would say, "the doctor," without ever saying a specialty. The clinic locations would shift. One time it was near Tempe, another time off I-17, but never an address. Brianna never spoke directly to Pat, not even to say thank you. And once, Pat did something small that made her stomach drop. After one frantic call, she drove to a Banner Health building Kyle mentioned. She did not go inside. She simply sat in her car in the parking lot, watching people walk in and out. She expected to see Kyle's truck. It never came. Pat drove home in silence. Her hands on the steering wheel felt colder than the air conditioning. That night, she looked at her bank account and wrote down the amount she had sent. $2,000, $500, $200, $300. 4 emergencies in 8 weeks. When she added them up, she felt sick. And still, when Kyle called again the next weekend, her first thought wasn't anger. It was, please don't be dead. That was how the trap worked. The hook wasn't money. The hook was a mother's fear. Pat went to bed that night with her phone on her pillow like a lifeline. She did not know that the cruel email, the one that would finally break the pattern, was already drafted, waiting for the right moment to land. The next emergency arrived on a Sunday afternoon, when the heat outside felt like someone had opened an oven door. Pat had just returned from grocery shopping. She stood in her kitchen putting away bottled water and salad greens when her phone rang. Kyle's name flashed again. Pat answered on the second ring. "Kyle?" His voice came fast, strained. "Mom, I need you right now. Like right now." Pat's hand tightened on the phone. "What happened?" "It's me," Kyle said. "I'm at urgent care. Chest pain. They're running tests. They said it could be serious." Pat's breath caught. The words chest pain and serious don't leave room for calm. "Where are you?" she asked, already moving toward her purse. "I'm not asking you to come," Kyle said, and Pat heard something underneath the rush. Calculation. "They're asking for a payment up front. It's $487. Can you send it? They won't start certain tests until it's handled." The number was oddly specific. That usually sounded real. That was part of the technique. Real numbers make lies feel like paperwork. Pat forced herself to slow down. "Kyle, if it's chest pain, why aren't they sending you to the ER? Urgent care doesn't—" "Mom," Kyle snapped, then lowered his voice. "Please don't do this. Please. I'm scared." Pat closed her eyes. Her heart pounded too, but not from fear alone. Something sharp had woken up in her mind, like a teacher hearing a student repeat the same excuse for the 4th time. "Okay," she said softly. "Text me the address." There was a pause. "I can't," Kyle said. "They're moving me." "To where?" "Just to a room," he said, then changed tactics. "Mom, I need the money. Zelle is fastest." Pat stared at her kitchen table. The sun poured through the blinds, making stripes across the printed coupons she hadn't thrown away yet. She felt how quiet her condo was. She felt how alone she was with this decision. "Send me a photo of the intake paperwork," Pat said. "I'll pay as soon as I see it." Kyle exhaled hard. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I love you," Pat said, and surprised herself with how steady her voice sounded. "And because I need to know where my money is going." Kyle's tone shifted, colder. "Mom, you're vulnerable to scams. You watch the news and then you think everyone is lying. This is exactly what I'm talking about." Hearing her own son use that line again made Pat feel like she'd swallowed sand. "I'm not accusing you," she said. "I'm asking for basic information." Another pause. Then Kyle said, "Fine, I'll send something." A minute later, a photo arrived. It was a close-up of a piece of paper. The image was slightly blurred, the edges cut off. Pat could read one thing clearly. A patient name. Kyle Walker. There was also a line that looked like copay, but the rest was smeared by motion blur. The logo at the top was cropped out. Pat's eyes went to the bottom. There in the corner was a date stamp. It was yesterday. Pat didn't move for a long moment. The kitchen felt too bright. The air conditioner hummed. Her coffee maker clicked as it cooled. Yesterday. Kyle's voice came through the phone again, impatient now. Did you see it? Can you send it? Pat said, I saw it. So send it. Pat opened her laptop and logged into her Wells Fargo account. She pulled up her transaction history. The last urgent care payment had not gone to any clinic. It had gone to Kyle. The description was clear. Zell to Kyle W. Pat remembered suddenly how he always pushed Zell, how he always said it was fastest, how he never asked her to pay a hospital directly. Pat felt her face get hot, not from the Arizona weather, from the realization that the money never had a chance to touch medical care at all. Kyle, she said carefully, why can't I pay the clinic? Because that's not how it works, Kyle said too quickly. They don't take payments over the phone like that. Mom, stop making this harder. Pat looked at the photo again. Yesterday. A paper that could have been printed anywhere. A cropped logo. She heard herself ask, What's the name of the clinic? Kyle hesitated. It's Banner. I told you. Which one? Mom, you're doing it again. Pat's throat tightened, but she pushed through. If you want money from me, I need to know where you are. His patience snapped. Fine, Kyle said. Forget it. I'll figure it out. The call ended. Pat stood in her kitchen holding her phone like it was something dangerous. She expected a wave of relief because maybe he'd get help elsewhere. Instead, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Anger. Not loud anger. Not screaming anger. The kind that settles in the bones and says, enough. 10 minutes later, a text arrived from an unknown number. It was Brianna. Pat, he's really scared. Please don't do this to him. The message read, You know how he is when he panics. Pat stared at the screen. Brianna had never called her. Brianna had never said thank you for anything. But now Brianna was available to pressure her. Pat typed a response, deleted it, typed again, deleted again. Finally, she wrote, Send the clinic name and address. No answer. An hour passed, then another. The apartment stayed quiet. Pat's mind replayed the date stamp on the paper like a siren. She made a decision, not a dramatic one, a practical one. The next morning, Pat drove to her Wells Fargo branch early, before the worst heat of the day. The parking lot was already busy with people escaping their own worries inside air-conditioned walls. Pat walked up to the teller window and asked for printed receipts of every transfer she'd made to Kyle in the last 3 months. The teller, a young man with a polite smile, asked, Is there a problem? Pat heard herself say, I need to understand a pattern. He nodded without judgment and printed the papers. The receipts came out in a neat stack, each one with dates, amounts, and destinations. Pat stared at them like they were a timeline of her own shame. When she got home, she placed the receipts on the kitchen table beside the printed email. Then she opened a blank spreadsheet on her laptop. She titled it, Medical Emergencies. And she began to build the case that would either prove her wrong or prove her son had been lying to her for money. As she typed the first row, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was the email. Stop asking for help. You're on your own. Pat read it once, then again, and in the silence of her condo, she realized something that made her hands stop moving. Kyle wasn't just taking money. Kyle was preparing to punish her if she refused. How far would he go to keep control? Pat didn't know yet, but she was about to find out. Pat's first instinct was to hide the spreadsheet. It was an old reflex. Keep the difficult things private. Solve them quietly. Don't make a scene. But as she looked at the printed email, she understood that secrecy protected Kyle, not her. So she did what she had trained herself to do for decades. She brought the work to someone who dealt in facts. At the senior center, a bulletin board held flyers for Medicare workshops and Avoid Scams seminars. A small card advertised a local accountant who volunteered time for seniors on fixed incomes. Budget review, fraud awareness, paperwork support. Pat tore off a tab. 2 days later, she sat across from the accountant in a modest office that smelled like printer ink. His name was Daniel Leary. Calm voice, careful questions, no drama. Pat placed the Wells Fargo receipts on his desk and said, "These are payments to my son. He claims they were medical emergencies." Daniel flipped through the pages slowly. "Did you ever pay a clinic directly?" he asked. Pat shook her head. "Did you ever receive a bill, discharge summary, or invoice?" he asked. "No," Pat said. "He says it comes later." Pat slid the printed email forward. Daniel read it once, then looked up. "This is a cutoff," he said. Pat nodded. I replied, "Understood. That's all." "That was the right length," Daniel said, and Pat felt her throat tighten. She hadn't realized how badly she needed someone to validate what she'd done. Daniel asked for Pat's full bank statements, months, not days. Pat returned with a thick folder, every page crisp and labeled. Daniel built a simple spreadsheet with columns for date, amount, method, reason claimed, evidence provided, and destination. The first pattern was obvious. Transfers clustered around weekends and late nights. Times when Pat was alone and more likely to panic. Times when verifying details was harder. The second pattern was colder. Each emergency was followed by silence. 2 or 3 days where Kyle didn't call, didn't check in, didn't ask about Pat's life. Then, just as Pat relaxed, he would reach out casually. "Hey, Mom, how's your week?" It wasn't concern. It was reset. The third pattern was the one that made Pat's stomach turn. Daniel asked Pat to list every time Kyle warned her about scams. It was almost every call. "Mom, you're vulnerable to scams." Daniel tapped the email. "This language and that repeated framing can be a setup," he said. "A setup for what?" Pat asked. "Guardianship pressure," Daniel said carefully. "A psychiatric evaluation request. A claim that you can't manage your finances." Pat had heard those stories at the senior center. Adult children calling parents confused, taking over accounts, controlling access. It always sounded far away. Now it sounded like a plan. Pat tried to protest. "Kyle would never." Daniel asked one question that cut through her guilt. "What kind of son tells his mother she's on her own?" Pat didn't answer. Over the next week, Pat gathered more evidence. Screenshots of texts, Brianna's one message, times, dates, and amounts written neatly in pen, originals in the documentation folder, copies in a second folder, stored elsewhere. Then a thick HOA envelope arrived in her mailbox. It wasn't about landscaping. It was a notice about a guest vehicle parked overnight in Pat's assigned spot several times. The letter included dates and a grainy photo. Pat stared at the truck in the image. Kyle's truck. Kyle had been at her condo when she wasn't home. Pat walked through her living room slowly, checking drawers and closets, listening to the air conditioner and the quiet. Nothing obvious was missing. That didn't calm her. It made her wonder what he had been looking for. That night, just after midnight, her phone buzzed. Kyle's name appeared again. Pat answered with a calm voice that didn't match the pounding in her chest. "Kyle." His tone wasn't scared. It was irritated. "Mom? Why are you acting weird?" Pat glanced at the spreadsheet. Daniel's words echoed. "Document everything." "Because something is wrong," Pat said. Kyle scoffed. "Nothing's wrong. You're just in your head. Brianna and I were talking, and honestly, we think you need to get checked out." Pat's spine went stiff. "Checked out how?" Kyle's voice went smooth, almost gentle. "A mental health evaluation, just to make sure you're okay." You've been paranoid. You've been asking for proof. That's not normal. Pat heard the trap click into place. If she argued, he'd say she was unstable. If she stayed quiet, he'd call it confusion. Kyle continued, "If you don't cooperate, Mom, we'll have to take steps. We can't just watch you spiral." Pat didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She said, "Understood." There was a beat of silence. Kyle didn't know what to do with a mother who wasn't begging. Pat ended the call and wrote the time and date on a sticky note. She saved the call record. She placed it beside the HOA letter and the printed email. Now the story wasn't only about money, it was about control. And Pat was done being controlled. Pat moved faster once the threat became clear. If Kyle wanted to paint her as confused, Pat needed a paper trail that showed the opposite: planning, clarity, and intent. Not rage, not revenge, just structure. Daniel recommended a local estate attorney who worked with retirees and understood family conflict. Pat scheduled an appointment for the next morning, choosing the earliest slot. In Phoenix, early wasn't just preference, it was survival. The attorney's office was in a low building with beige walls and cool air that smelled faintly of coffee. The waiting room had brochures about wills, trusts, and powers of attorney. Pat sat with her documentation folder on her lap like a shield. When the attorney walked in, she introduced herself as Ms. Haynes, mid-40s, clear voice, the kind of woman who didn't waste time. Pat didn't start with her feelings. She started with facts. "My son requested money repeatedly for medical emergencies," Pat said. "I paid. I have receipts. Now he's threatening a mental health evaluation because I asked for proof." Ms. Haynes listened, asked a few questions, and then said something Pat didn't expect. "This is common," she said, "and it escalates when the money stops." Pat's hands clenched. "What do I do?" "First," Ms. Haynes said, "you protect your finances. Second, you protect your autonomy. Third, you prepare for the exact thing he threatened." Pat felt a cold wave move through her. He could actually do it? "He can try," Ms. Haynes said. "Anyone can file a petition. The question is what evidence he has versus what evidence you have." Pat opened her folder. She placed the printed email on the desk. Then the Wells Fargo receipts. Then the spreadsheet printout Daniel had helped format. Clean columns, dates, amounts, and a notes section listing what proof Kyle had provided. Ms. Haynes read, then nodded once. "You've done the right thing so far," she said. "Now let's make it harder for him to weaponize your kindness." They discussed options. Pat already had a will. Ms. Haynes explained that a will mattered after death. Pat needed protection while she was alive. That's where the trust came in. Pat didn't want to disinherit Kyle out of spite. She wanted boundaries that couldn't be talked around. Ms. Haynes suggested a partial, irrevocable trust, a structure that would lock a portion of Pat's assets for her own future care, with clear rules, and limit any single person's ability to pressure her into releasing funds. Pat listened as the attorney broke it down in plain language. "Think of it like a fence," Ms. Haynes said. "A fence doesn't mean you hate the neighbor. It means you're clear about what's yours." Pat swallowed. "And Kyle?" "He can't bully a fence," Ms. Haynes said. Pat signed preliminary paperwork that day. Updated beneficiary designations, a new durable power of attorney naming a trusted friend from the senior center, not Kyle, and a document stating her preference for independent medical evaluations if competency was ever questioned. Ms. Haynes also advised something that felt almost old-fashioned. "Send him a registered letter," she said. "Not an emotional letter. A factual notice. Tell him that future requests for medical-related funds must come with verifiable documentation and direct payment instructions. Tell him you will not send person-to-person transfers for medical care." Pat felt her stomach twist. He'll explode. "Yes," Ms. Haynes said. and that reaction becomes part of your evidence. Pat left the office with a thick envelope of signed forms and a clear checklist. 1. Move a portion of funds into the trust structure. 2. Limit transfer capabilities on her accounts. 3. Create a separate bills-only account for monthly expenses. 4. Communicate boundaries in writing. Registered. That afternoon, Pat returned to Wells Fargo. The lobby was busy with people escaping the heat. She met with a banker in a small office and requested specific changes: lowered Zelle limits, removal of saved recipients, and alerts for any attempted transfers over a certain amount. The banker asked, "Is someone pressuring you?" Pat didn't hesitate. "Yes." The banker nodded, typed, and set the changes in place. Pat watched the screen like it was a locked door sliding shut. Before leaving, Pat requested additional printed receipts and asked the banker to stamp them. It wasn't required. Pat wanted it anyway. Official ink makes denial harder. That evening, Pat sat at her kitchen table and wrote the registered letter. It was short, factual, and almost painfully calm. It referenced the exact amounts and dates. It stated that future medical emergency claims would require the facility name, address, contact number, and an invoice showing a patient name and itemized charges. It stated she would pay the facility directly, not a personal account. It stated the threats of mental health evaluations would be documented and treated as harassment. Pat read it twice, then signed it with steady handwriting. The next morning, she drove to the post office before the sun turned brutal. She paid for certified mail with return receipt, watched the clerk stamp it, and kept the receipt with her bank papers. When she got home, she placed the certified mail receipt beside the printed email, 2 small rectangles of paper that now carried the weight of her future. For 3 days, Kyle was quiet. That silence didn't comfort Pat. It felt like a pause before impact. On the 4th day, her phone lit up with Kyle's name. Pat didn't answer. A voicemail arrived. Kyle's voice was sharp, controlled, and loud enough to hear through the speaker without playing it. "What is this, Mom?" he said. "A registered letter? Are you serious? You're acting like I'm some stranger, like I'm scamming you. This is exactly what I mean. You're not thinking straight." Pat listened once, then saved the voicemail. Another message arrived seconds later, this time from Brianna. "Pat, he's devastated," Brianna typed. "This isn't healthy for you. Please talk to someone." Pat stared at the text and felt a strange clarity. Brianna's concern was never about Pat. It was always about Pat's compliance. Pat didn't respond. That night around 9:30, a knock hit Pat's door so hard the frame rattled. Pat froze. Her condo was quiet. The hallway outside echoed with footsteps. Another knock, harder. "Mom!" Kyle's voice shouted through the door. "Open up!" Pat's heart slammed. The HOA letter flashed in her mind. Kyle showing up when she wasn't home. Now he was here when she was. Pat did not open the door. She stepped back, phone in hand, and checked the peephole. Kyle stood outside with Brianna behind him, arms crossed, face tight with fury. Kyle's eyes weren't worried. They were offended. He knocked again, then said loud enough for neighbors to hear, "Mom, you're not safe. You need help. Open the door." Pat's hands shook, but her voice stayed calm as she spoke through the door. "Kyle, leave. This is not appropriate." Kyle's face twisted. "So you're refusing? Fine, fine. If you won't let us in, we'll do this the official way." Pat felt her blood run cold. The official way meant papers, petitions, evaluations, a judge. Kyle leaned closer to the door and dropped his voice into something almost tender, the way people talk when they want to sound reasonable. "Mom," he said, "if you make this hard, we're going to have to tell people you're not okay." Pat's throat tightened. She didn't open the door. She didn't argue. She lifted her phone and started recording audio. "Repeat that," Pat said quietly. Kyle blinked, realizing too late what she'd done, and in that small moment, Pat saw the truth on his face. He wasn't afraid for her. He was afraid of losing access. Kyle stepped back, jaw clenched. "You're proving my point," he spat. "You're paranoid." Pat replied, with the same calm she'd used in her letter. "No," she said. "I'm documented." Then she heard Brianna whisper something, and Kyle's expression changed from rage to calculation again. He pointed a finger at the door. "You're going to regret this," he said. "You hear me? You're going to regret this." Footsteps moved away. The hallway fell quiet. Pat stood in her living room with the phone still recording, her heart pounding, the air conditioner humming like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Kyle had just threatened her out loud, on her doorstep, with witnesses nearby. Pat saved the file, wrote down the time, and placed the note in her folder. Because the next step, she realized, wouldn't be another fake emergency. It would be retaliation, and Pat needed to be ready. Retaliation came disguised as concern. 2 mornings after Kyle's doorstep threat, Pat returned from the senior center to find a business card wedged in her doorframe. The card wasn't from a neighbor, it was from a mobile assessment service with a generic logo and a phone number. On the back, someone had written in pen, "Call us to schedule your evaluation." Pat stared at it until her skin prickled. Kyle didn't need to break in, he could break her reputation. She brought the card inside and placed it in the documentation folder. Then she called Ms. Haynes. The attorney's voice stayed calm. "Don't call them," she said. "If there's a real petition, you will be formally served. Until then, this is pressure." Pat tried to breathe. "What if he calls the police?" "He might," Ms. Haynes said. "If they come for a welfare check, be polite, be cooperative, and document everything." Pat didn't like living like this, but she did it. She charged her phone. She kept her folder by the door. She wrote a simple note to herself on the first page. "Stay calm. Ask for names. Ask for badge numbers." That afternoon, Phoenix heat rose like a wall. Pat stayed inside, curtains drawn halfway, water bottle close. Her phone remained quiet until 6:17 p.m. A knock sounded, not the pounding from Kyle, but firm and official. Pat's heart jumped. She walked to the door, checked the peephole, and saw 2 uniformed officers standing in the hallway. She opened the door, keeping the chain latched. "Hello," she said. One officer spoke gently. "Ma'am, we're here for a welfare check. We received a call that you might be in distress." Pat felt her stomach tighten, but her voice stayed level. "Who called?" The officer looked at a small notepad. "A family member." Pat nodded slowly. "Understood. May I have your names and badge numbers, please?" The officer blinked, surprised by the question, then provided them. Pat repeated the numbers out loud as she wrote them on a notepad. She was polite. She was calm. She was visibly organized. "Are you safe?" the second officer asked. "Yes," Pat said. "Do you have food and water?" the first officer asked, glancing past Pat into the condo. "Yes," Pat said. She stepped back slightly so they could see the clean kitchen, the calendar on the wall, the stack of mail sorted into trays. The second officer asked, "Do you have any medical issues that aren't being treated?" Pat shook her head. "No, I see my doctor regularly. I manage my own appointments." The officers exchanged a look that suggested Pat was not what they expected, not confused, not incoherent, not frail. Pat asked, "May I show you something?" They agreed. Pat unlatched the chain, opened the door, and retrieved her documentation folder from the table, keeping it closed. She didn't dump her life on them. She simply held the folder like a sign. "My son has been requesting money using claimed emergencies," Pat said. "When I asked for verification, he threatened a mental health evaluation. I'm documenting it with my attorney. I believe the welfare check is retaliation. The first officer's expression tightened. Do you feel threatened by him? Pat paused. She didn't want to sound dramatic, but she also knew minimization was how she had ended up here. Yes, Pat said. He came to my door and made threats. I did not let him in. The second officer asked, Has he tried to enter your home? Pat remembered the HOA letter. Kyle's truck. Overnight visits. She said, Not while I was home, but he has been on my property without permission. The first officer nodded. If he shows up again and refuses to leave, call us, he said. You have the right to feel safe in your home. Pat thanked them. They left, and the hallway quiet returned. Pat stood in her doorway for a long moment after they were gone, feeling both relief and grief. Relief that the officers saw the truth. Grief that it had come to this. Her phone buzzed as soon as she shut the door. Kyle texted, See? This is why you need help. You're causing scenes. Pat didn't respond. She screenshot the message, saved it, and printed it. 10 minutes later, Brianna texted, Please don't fight him. Stress is dangerous at your age. Pat printed that too. The next day, Pat met Daniel again. He reviewed the new messages and said something Pat hadn't wanted to admit. They're building a narrative, Daniel said. They're trying to make you look unstable so they can justify control. Pat whispered, Why would he want control? Daniel turned his laptop screen toward her. Pat, look at your transaction history around the time he started these emergencies. Pat leaned in. Daniel pointed to patterns in Pat's outgoing transfers and then to what happened in Pat's account afterward. Kyle wasn't just pulling money. He was timing it around Pat's fixed income deposits. He knew when her pension hit. He knew when her Social Security came in. He called right before those dates when she had less cash on hand. Then he called again right after when he assumed she could send more. It was systematic. Pat felt her face burn. How long has he been doing this? Daniel didn't guess. He said, Let's check. They looked back further. Another transfer 6 months earlier labeled as help. Another one before that. Not emergencies then, just rent, car repair, a short gap. The emergencies were new. The taking was not. Pat's guilt surged, hot and sharp. She heard her own thoughts. Maybe if Pat had been a better mother, Kyle wouldn't be like this. Maybe if Pat had stayed married, he'd be stable. Maybe, Daniel interrupted gently. Pat, you can't solve his character by paying his bills. Pat nodded, but it still hurt. That evening, Pat received an email notification from her HOA. It was an announcement, special meeting regarding resident welfare concerns. Pat read it twice. The language was polite, vague, and terrifying. Someone had complained. Someone was spreading a story. Pat didn't sleep much. She sat at her kitchen table, stapling copies of receipts and documents like she was preparing for trial. At 2:03 a.m., her printer ran out of paper. Pat replaced it with steady hands. In the morning, Pat drove to the post office and mailed one more letter. This one to Ms. Haynes, with updated evidence, just in case something happened to Pat's own files. When Pat got home, there was a notice taped to the door. Not from the HOA. From the court. A process server had delivered it while Pat was out. At the top, in bold letters, were words Pat never wanted attached to her name. Petition for evaluation. Pat's hands shook as she peeled the paper off. The hallway felt too bright. The air felt thin. Kyle had done it. He had gone official, and now Pat had to walk into a system that could decide whether she stayed in control of her own life or lost it. Pat carried the notice inside and placed it on the table beside the printed email. Then Pat picked up the phone and called Ms. Haynes. Pat's voice was steady. They filed, Pat said. On the other end, the attorney's tone sharpened. Okay, Ms. Haynes replied. Now, We respond. And Pat. Bring every piece of proof you have. Pat looked at the spreadsheet, at the bank receipts, at the certified mail stub. Pat whispered, "Understood." And for the first time, the word didn't feel like surrender. It felt like strategy. The petition changed the tone overnight. Kyle stopped sounding angry and started sounding wounded. 2 days after the court notice arrived, a bouquet showed up at Pat's door in a cardboard box. Bright flowers that looked cheerful in a way that felt insulting. The card read, "Love you, Mom. Let's fix this." No apology, no acknowledgement of the threat, just a request wrapped in petals. Later that afternoon, another delivery arrived. This one a small gift bag with a candle and a handwritten note from Brianna. "We care about you. We just want you safe." Pat placed both notes in her folder. She didn't throw them away. She didn't display them. She treated them like evidence because she had learned that sweetness could be a weapon. That evening, Kyle called again. Pat let it go to voicemail. The message that followed sounded almost rehearsed. "Mom, please," Kyle said.
"This is getting out of control. People are talking. The HOA is worried. You're stressing yourself out. Just let us help. We can handle the finances for you. You won't have to worry." Pat listened to the voicemail twice. The sentence that stood out wasn't concern. It was handle the finances. Ms. Haynes was clear. Do not meet alone. Do not allow Kyle into the home. If Pat wanted to communicate, do it in writing or with a witness. Pat chose the senior center as the safest neutral ground.
It had cameras in the hallway and staff nearby. Pat asked a trusted friend, Marlene, to sit at a nearby table within earshot. Marlene was 72, sharp and unafraid of conflict. She also volunteered at the front desk and knew how to call for help if needed. Kyle agreed to meet. He arrived late, wearing sunglasses and a forced smile. Brianna followed, dressed neatly, hair perfect, as if appearing stable would make Pat look unstable by comparison. Pat sat with her posture straight and a paper folder on the table. She didn't bring the whole binder. She brought a few pages, enough to show she was prepared. Kyle sat down and sighed dramatically. "Mom," he said, "look at you. You look tired." Pat didn't bite. "What do you want, Kyle?" Kyle spread his hands, a gesture meant to look open. "I want peace," he said. "I want my mom back. This paranoia isn't you." Brianna nodded. "We're worried," she added softly. "At your age, stress can really hurt you." Pat watched them closely. Their words were gentle, but their eyes kept flicking to the folder. Kyle leaned forward. "Just tell me what you need," he said. "We'll fix it, we can reverse the petition, we can make everything normal again." Pat asked one simple question. "Why did you file it?" Kyle's smile tightened. "Because you're acting irrational." Pat didn't argue. Pat slid a single page across the table. It was Pat's spreadsheet summary. Dates, amounts, and the words, "claimed medical emergency," next to each transfer. At the bottom, in bold, the total. Kyle glanced at it and scoffed. "So, this is about money." Pat kept her voice calm. "It's about truth." Brianna reached for the page, then stopped herself. "Pat, people get confused," she said. "Maybe you're mixing things up. Maybe you don't remember what you agreed to." Pat looked directly at her. "Pat remembers," Pat said, referring to herself the way her own name reminded her of her role. Adult, present, clear. Kyle's jaw clenched. "Mom, listen," he said, dropping the soft tone. "We're drowning right now, okay? Everything is expensive. Rent went up. My job situation is complicated." Pat noticed he finally mentioned rent, not a hospital, not urgent care. Kyle continued, "I'm trying to make things work. I'm trying to build something, but you keep making it harder with this paperwork and demands. Pat asked, "What are you building?" Kyle's eyes darted. "Investments," he said. "Trading." Daniel had already suspected it. Now it was confirmed. Pat said, "Day trading?" Kyle stiffened. "Don't say it like that. It's not gambling." Brianna jumped in. "Kyle is really smart," she said. "He's just in a tough patch, and you have resources, Pat. You're comfortable. You could help without making it humiliating." There it was, the truth finally, without the hospital costume. Pat kept her voice steady. "You asked for money for medical emergencies." Kyle waved a hand. "It's all the same thing," he snapped. "It's survival." Pat felt heat climb her neck. "No," she said, "it's not the same. You used fear." Kyle leaned forward, dropping his voice. "Mom, you're making this bigger than it is," he said. "You're going to embarrass yourself. A judge is going to see a lonely old woman spiraling on the internet and think, yeah, she needs supervision." Marlene, sitting nearby, shifted in her chair. Pat didn't react outwardly. Inside, something went cold. Kyle wasn't pleading anymore. He was threatening again in a quieter way. Pat opened her folder and pulled out one page, just one, the printed email. "Stop asking for help. You're on your own." Pat placed it on the table and watched Kyle's eyes move across it. His face changed, fast. He recognized how cruel it looked when it sat on paper, stripped of tone and excuses. Kyle's mouth opened, then closed. "You," he started. Pat said, "This is why Pat documented." Brianna tried a softer approach, voice trembling on purpose. "Pat, we didn't mean it like that," she said. Kyle was stressed. "You know how he gets. He loves you." Pat asked, "Then why threaten evaluation?" Kyle's control slipped. "Because you're acting crazy," he hissed. "You're acting like you're some investigator, like you don't trust your own family." Pat leaned slightly forward. "Pat trusts proof," Pat said. Kyle laughed sharply. "Okay, fine," he said. "You want proof? Here's proof. You can't handle this. You're alone. You don't have anyone. You need us." The words landed like a shove. Pat looked past Kyle and Brianna to the room around them, older adults doing puzzles, staff setting up chairs, a volunteer making coffee. A community Pat had built without Kyle. Pat said quietly, "Pat has people." Kyle's eyes narrowed. "Who?" he challenged. Pat didn't point at Marlene. Pat didn't need to. The cameras did the work. The witnesses did the work. Pat stood, gathering the papers. "The meeting is over," Pat said. Kyle's voice sharpened. "If you walk away, Mom, you'll regret it. We can make this so hard for you." Pat paused, looked at him, and said calmly, "Pat is already prepared." Kyle stood too, anger flashing. "You think a spreadsheet beats family?" he snapped. Pat answered, "A spreadsheet beats lies." Kyle's face reddened. He leaned in and lowered his voice, as if shame was a private tool. "You know you weren't a perfect mom," Kyle said. "You know you made mistakes. This is you trying to punish me because you feel guilty." Pat felt the old wound open, the divorce, the nights Kyle ate frozen dinners, the school concerts Pat missed because she was grading papers and trying to keep the lights on. Kyle knew exactly where to press. Pat's breath caught for a second. Then Pat remembered something Daniel had said. Guilt is not a contract. Pat straightened. "Pat's mistakes are not a permission slip," Pat said. Kyle's eyes widened. He hadn't expected her to refuse the guilt. Brianna grabbed Kyle's arm. "Come on," she whispered. Kyle turned away, but as he walked off, he threw one last line over his shoulder, loud enough for nearby people to hear. "Everyone will see you're not okay." Pat watched him leave. Pat's hands were shaking, but Pat's spine stayed straight. Because now Pat understood the final shape of the fight. Kyle wasn't trying to win money anymore. Kyle was trying to win the right to declare Pat incompetent. And the court date was coming. The weeks before the hearing felt like living under a clock that never stopped ticking. Phoenix kept getting hotter. The air outside shimmered by mid-morning. And Pat found herself drinking water even when she wasn't thirsty, as if hydration could protect her from what was coming. The petition included a proposed date for an evaluation and a request for temporary authority if the evaluator deemed Pat impaired. The language was clinical, polite, and dangerous. Ms. Haynes explained the stakes in plain terms. If a judge believes you can't manage finances, they can appoint someone to do it, she said. Sometimes it's a family member, sometimes it's a professional. Either way, your life changes. Pat heard that and felt the floor tilt. Not because she was confused, but because the idea of losing autonomy was a different kind of fear than losing money. Pat took action in 3 directions at once. First, she controlled her environment. She installed a simple door camera recommended by a neighbor, nothing fancy, just enough to capture faces and timestamps. She asked the HOA for a copy of the hallway camera policy and requested that any security footage related to her unit be preserved. She wasn't accusing. She was documenting. Second, she controlled her narrative. Pat scheduled an appointment with her primary care provider and asked for a full checkup. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked for accurate records. "I'm being threatened with a competency petition," Pat told the nurse. "I need my medical file to reflect that I'm functioning." The provider listened, asked questions, and documented Pat's orientation, memory, and ability to explain her finances. Pat answered clearly. Pat listed medications, none that impaired cognition. Pat described routine, driving, volunteer schedule. The file became another layer of proof. Third, Pat controlled evidence. Daniel helped Pat tighten the spreadsheet into something that could be understood quickly by a third party. The narrative section wasn't emotional. It was chronological. Date, claimed emergency, requested amount, method of transfer, destination, proof provided, follow-up requested, response. Pat added a final column. Threats, pressure after refusal. Pat filled it with exact quotes from texts and voicemails. One evening, a new message arrived from Kyle. "Mom, the evaluator is scheduled. Don't make it ugly." Pat didn't respond. Pat saved it. An hour later, another message. "If you fail, we'll have to step in. It's for your own good." Pat saved that too. At 11:32 p.m., the third message came. "You know you weren't perfect. Don't make me tell people why." Pat stared at that one longer than the others. It wasn't about care. It was about humiliation. Kyle was trying to control her with the threat of shame. Pat printed the message and wrote, in the margin, blackmail tone. The next day, Pat did something Daniel suggested with a quiet seriousness. "Pat, we should see what pressure Kyle is under," he said. Not to gossip, to understand motive. Pat didn't have access to Kyle's bank records, but some pressure leaves footprints. Daniel searched public court records in Maricopa County with Pat sitting beside him. Pat's hands trembled as the screen loaded. Then the record appeared. An eviction filing. Kyle Walker, filed less than 3 weeks before the first appendix emergency. Pat's throat tightened. The dates aligned too well. Kyle had started the medical panic right when housing was collapsing. Daniel printed the record. Pat stared at it like it was a photograph of a secret. How long had he been hiding this? Pat whispered. Daniel didn't answer with emotion. He answered with clarity. Long enough to decide that fear was easier than honesty. Pat drove home and sat in her car for a moment before going inside. She looked at the sun beating on the dashboard and thought about Kyle as a boy, asking her to sign permission slips. Kyle as a teenager, insisting he was fine. Kyle as an adult, saying, "Trust me." Now she had to sign something else. Consent to fight. A few days later, Wells Fargo called Pat. The number was legitimate. Pat answered, cautious. "This is the Fraud Prevention Department," a woman said. "We flagged an attempted change to your account alerts. Did you request that?" Pat's heart jumped. "No," Pat said. "Did you give anyone access to your account information?" the woman asked. Pat's mouth went dry. "No." The woman explained that someone had called claiming to be Pat, attempted to answer security questions, and asked to raise transfer limits. The attempt was blocked, but the call was logged. Pat's hands shook as she thanked the woman and hung up. Then Pat stared at the phone, knowing exactly who had done it. Kyle. The very man who claimed Pat was vulnerable to scams had tried to impersonate her to increase access. Pat called Ms. Haynes immediately. The attorney's voice tightened. "That's important," Ms. Haynes said. "Get the call log. Get a written note from the bank if possible." Pat drove to the branch the next morning, stood in a short line, and asked to speak to a manager. Pat didn't raise her voice. Pat asked for documentation. The manager could not give identity, but he could provide a note confirming an attempted change request and the date and time it occurred. He stamped it and handed it to Pat. Pat felt grief burn behind the eyes, not just because Kyle had done it, but because Kyle had the confidence to do it, as if Pat's accounts were already his. That evening, the door camera alerted Pat to motion in the hallway. Pat opened the app and saw Kyle standing at the door again. This time he wasn't pounding. He was looking around, checking if anyone was watching. Brianna stood farther back, phone in hand. Kyle didn't knock. He slid something under the door. Pat waited until they left. Then Pat opened the door and picked up the paper. It was a care plan proposal, printed and highlighted with bullet points. Kyle would assist with finances. Brianna would help with appointments. Pat would reduce driving for safety. Pat would consider moving to a managed community. It was presented like kindness. It read like takeover. At the bottom, Kyle had written, "Sign this and we can stop the evaluation." Pat's hands shook as she read it. This wasn't about health. It was bargaining, surrender control, or be labeled incompetent. Pat didn't sign. Pat placed the paper in the folder, then sat at the table and stared at the printed email again. "Stop asking for help. You're on your own." The line hit differently now. Kyle had told her she was on her own, then tried to force her into dependence. What kind of son does that? Pat turned to a blank page in the binder and wrote one sentence as if planning a lesson. Goal: demonstrate competency, demonstrate pattern of exploitation, demonstrate retaliation. Then Pat prepared to walk into an evaluation and speak about her own son as a threat, without sounding bitter, without sounding confused, and without letting grief turn into noise. Because if Pat lost composure, Kyle would call it proof. So Pat practiced being calm, and the day of the evaluation arrived like a heat wave. Quiet, relentless, and impossible to ignore. The evaluation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Pat woke at 4:50 a.m., earlier than usual, not because she wanted to, but because her body refused rest. She moved through her routine anyway. Water, a few gentle stretches, a plain breakfast. She dressed in simple clothes that made her feel like herself. Clean slacks, a light blouse, comfortable shoes. No costume, no attempt to look young. Just present. Ms. Haynes met Pat in the parking lot of an outpatient clinic affiliated with Banner Health. The building looked like most clinics in Phoenix: tan walls, glass doors, desert plants near the entrance. Inside, fluorescent lighting made everything feel colder than it was. There was signage on the walls, but Pat didn't stare at it. She stared at her own hands, steadying them around the handle of her folder. Kyle and Brianna arrived together, walking in like they belonged there. Kyle wore a collared shirt and a practiced expression of concern. Brianna carried a tote bag and a bottle of water, playing the role of supportive partner. Kyle approached Pat with a soft voice that felt fake. "Hey, Mom," he said. "You doing okay?" Pat didn't respond to the tone. She responded to the reality. "Pat is fine," she said, keeping the third-person habit that helped her stay grounded and avoid emotional spirals. Kyle's eyes flicked to Ms. Haynes. His jaw tightened. A receptionist called Pat's name. Pat stood. Kyle stepped forward. "I should come with her," he said. Ms. Haynes blocked him with a calm certainty. "No," she said. "Pat will go in with counsel if counsel is allowed, and if not, Pat will go in alone. You can wait." Kyle smiled tightly. "See, this is what I mean," he said, loud enough to be heard. "She thinks everyone's against her." Pat didn't look at him. She followed the receptionist. The evaluator was a licensed psychologist contracted to provide competency assessments. The office was small and plain, with a desk, 2 chairs, and a box of tissues placed where people could reach it without asking. The evaluator introduced herself as Dr. Ellis. Her voice was neutral, her face professional. She explained the purpose of the appointment, the limits of confidentiality, and the process. Pat listened carefully and nodded. "Doctor," Ellis asked, "do you know why you're here?" Pat answered without hesitation. Pat's son filed a petition claiming Pat may not be able to manage finances. Pat disagrees. Pat believes the petition was filed after Pat refused to send more money without documentation. Dr. Ellis watched Pat closely. "Can you tell me your full name and date of birth?" Pat did. Correctly. "Where are you right now?" Dr. Ellis asked. "In an outpatient clinic in Phoenix," Pat said. "In a private office for an assessment." "Who is the current president?" Dr. Ellis asked. Pat answered. Dr. Ellis nodded and continued. The questions moved from orientation to practical tasks. Simple math, memory recall, understanding of monthly expenses, explanation of bank accounts. Pat described her income sources, her HOA dues, her utilities, her grocery budget. Pat explained that she drove herself, volunteered, and handled her own appointments. Dr. Ellis asked, "Do you have a spreadsheet of your finances?" Pat opened the folder and slid a clean printout forward. "Yes," Pat said. "Pat tracks everything." Dr. Ellis looked at the pages and asked, "Why did you start tracking transfers to your son?" Pat didn't dramatize. Pat's stated sequence claimed medical emergencies, pressure to send money quickly, refusal to provide verifiable documentation, repeated warning that Pat was vulnerable to scams, the sudden email cutoff. Pat placed the printed email on the desk. Dr. Ellis read it, then looked up. "How did that make you feel?" she asked. Pat paused. This was the moment where emotion could become a weapon if it overflowed. "It hurt," Pat said simply. "And it clarified." Dr. Ellis asked, "Clarified what?" "That the requests were not about care," Pat said. "They were about control." Dr. Ellis nodded slightly, taking notes. After 40 minutes, Dr. Ellis ended the assessment and said a report would be provided to the court. Pat stood, thanked her, and left the office without trying to persuade. Evidence persuades better than pleading. Back in the waiting area, Kyle stood quickly. "How did it go?" he asked. Pat didn't answer him. Pat looked at Ms. Haynes. The attorney's eyes were calm. "Now we wait for the hearing," she said. The hearing arrived 2 weeks later at a courthouse where the air inside felt like ice compared to the Arizona sun outside. Pat wore the same style of clothes, simple, neat, comfortable. Ms. Haynes carried a binder with tabs. Daniel sat behind them as a witness, quiet and steady. Kyle and Brianna sat across the aisle. Kyle looked around like he was nervous. but it didn't read as fear. It read as impatience. When the case was called, everyone stood. A judge entered, older, expression unreadable. The judge began with basics, confirming identities, explaining the purpose of the hearing, reminding everyone that this was about capacity and safety. Kyle spoke first. He sounded polished. "Your Honor, my mother has been acting paranoid," he said. "She's accusing us of scamming her. She's isolating. She's making spreadsheets. She's recording conversations. It's not normal behavior. We just want her safe." Pat watched Kyle's face as he spoke. His voice had practiced softness, but his eyes were hard. He wasn't here to protect her. He was here to win. The judge turned to Pat. "Ms. Walker," he said, "do you understand why we're here?" Pat answered clearly, "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you want someone appointed to manage your affairs?" the judge asked. "No," Pat said. "Pat is capable. Pat is documented." The judge glanced at Ms. Haynes. "Counsel?" Ms. Haynes stood. "Your Honor, we oppose the petition. We will show a pattern of financial exploitation and retaliation. The petitioner's concern is not medical, it is monetary." Kyle's posture stiffened. Ms. Haynes moved methodically. She didn't insult Kyle. She didn't accuse with emotion. She introduced evidence. First, the Wells Fargo receipts of repeated person-to-person transfers labeled by Pat as medical emergencies, with no direct payments to any clinic. Second, the spreadsheet showing the dates, amounts, and Kyle's inability to provide consistent verification. Third, the certified mail receipt for Pat's registered boundary letter and proof it was delivered. Fourth, the HOA notice showing Kyle's truck parked overnight at Pat's condo while Pat was away. Kyle shifted in his seat. Then Ms. Haynes introduced the voicemail and the doorstep recording. Not the whole thing. A short excerpt that captured Kyle's threat to do this the official way, and to tell people Pat wasn't okay if she didn't comply. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Kyle tried to explain. "I was upset," he said. "She was provoking me." Ms. Haynes didn't argue. She moved to the next piece, the eviction filing. "Your Honor," Ms. Haynes said, "the timing matters. The first medical emergency request occurred shortly after the petitioner faced an eviction filing. That is motive." Kyle's face turned red. "That's irrelevant," he snapped, then caught himself. The judge looked at him. "Control your tone," he said quietly. Then came the piece Pat had been holding like a final card, the bank fraud incident. Ms. Haynes presented a stamped note from Wells Fargo confirming an attempted change to Pat's account alerts and transfer limits, initiated by a caller claiming to be Pat. The note included the date and time. Then Ms. Haynes held up another document, a summary from the bank's internal log that listed the phone number used in the attempt, partially redacted, but showing the last 4 digits. The last 4 digits matched Kyle's number. Kyle's head jerked up. "That's—" he started. The judge held up a hand. "Is that your number?" the judge asked. Kyle hesitated. Brianna's eyes darted to him, warning. Kyle tried to laugh. "Numbers get spoofed," he said quickly. "Mom watches the news. She thinks everything is a scam. This is exactly—" Ms. Haynes cut in, calm. "Your Honor, the petitioner repeatedly told Ms. Walker she was vulnerable to scams, while simultaneously attempting to impersonate her at her bank to raise transfer limits. That is not a safety plan. That is exploitation." The courtroom felt very quiet. The judge turned to Kyle. "Why did you attempt to change her account settings?" he asked. Kyle's voice wavered. "I didn't. I was trying to help. She gets confused with apps." Pat didn't react. Pat let the lie hang in the air like smoke. The judge then asked Pat a series of questions directly, simple, practical, designed to test clarity. Pat answered each one without hesitation. Pat described monthly budget, routine, volunteer work, driving. Pat explained why documentation existed, because fear had been used against her, and documentation reduced fear. Finally, the judge looked at the evaluation report from Dr. Ellis. He read in silence for a moment. Then he spoke. "The evaluation does not support incapacity," the judge said. "Ms. Walker is oriented, organized, and capable of managing her affairs." Pat felt her lungs release a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The judge continued, "The petition is denied." Kyle's face tightened, fury flashing behind his eyes. The judge wasn't finished. "The evidence presented raises concerns of attempted financial exploitation," he said. "I am referring this matter to the appropriate agencies for review. I am also issuing an order prohibiting the petitioner from contacting Ms. Walker regarding her finances or attempting to access her accounts." Kyle's mouth opened as if to protest. The judge cut him off with one look. "Do you understand?" the judge asked. Kyle swallowed. "Yes," he said, forced. Brianna's posture stiffened. The calm mask cracked at the edges. Pat stood as the hearing ended, her hands shaking, but her face calm. Ms. Haynes squeezed her arm once, not as celebration but as confirmation. Pat had held the line. As they walked out, Kyle hissed under his breath, "You did this to me." Pat didn't turn around, because Pat finally understood something that took 69 years to fully accept. Kyle had done this to himself, and now the consequences were no longer private. They were official. The denial of the petition didn't end the story. It changed its direction. For Kyle, the courtroom wasn't just a loss. It was a crack in the image he used to move through life. The judge's referral set something in motion that Kyle couldn't talk his way out of. Within a week, Pat received a call from an investigator assigned to review the case. The voice on the phone was professional, neutral, and careful with words. "We're following up on concerns raised in a recent hearing," the investigator said. "We'd like to review documentation and ask you a few questions." Pat agreed, not because she wanted revenge, but because silence had been the tool that protected exploitation. Pat was done protecting it. Ms. Haynes sat with Pat during the interview. Pat answered questions the same way she had in court. Clear, chronological, supported by paper. Pat provided copies of receipts, texts, and the banknote. Pat described Kyle's pattern without exaggeration. The investigator asked, "Do you feel safe?" Pat answered honestly, "Safer than before." But Pat is careful. After the interview, Ms. Haynes helped Pat take one more protective step. A formal no-contact notice regarding finances, delivered in writing, reinforcing the court order. Pat didn't add insults. Pat didn't add emotion. Pat added structure. Kyle responded the way he always did when access closed. He tried charm. A week later, Pat's door camera captured Kyle standing outside her condo again, alone this time. He didn't knock hard. He waited. Then he left an envelope in front of her door like a peace offering. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Mom, I'm sorry," Kyle wrote. "I lost control. I was stressed. I never wanted this to happen." The words would have meant something if they had come months earlier without a court order behind them. Pat turned the page and found the real point. "I need help," Kyle wrote. "Just a small loan to get back on track. I'll pay you back. Please don't let everything fall apart." Pat stared at the letter, heart heavy. The apology was a doorway to the same room. Pat didn't call him. Pat didn't text. Pat didn't argue. Pat placed the letter in the binder and did what Ms. Haynes had taught her. Respond with boundaries, not emotion. Pat sent one line back through her attorney. All communication must go through counsel. Kyle tried again, this time through Brianna. A text arrived from an unfamiliar number. "Pat, he's going to lose his place," Brianna wrote. "If you have any heart, You'll help." Pat read it once and felt a strange calm. The manipulation had lost its power because Pat could finally see it as a pattern, not a personal failure. Pat didn't respond. 2 weeks later, Marlene at the senior center brought Pat a piece of gossip she didn't ask for. "Kyle was talking loud at a coffee shop," Marlene said quietly. "Saying his accounts are frozen, saying the bank won't work with him, saying his landlord filed again." Pat didn't smile. Pat didn't celebrate. Pat simply nodded, absorbing the reality. Consequences don't always look like handcuffs. Sometimes they look like doors closing. Kyle's trading strategy collapsed without fresh money. The overdue rent didn't disappear. The confidence that came from believing Pat would always rescue him cracked under the weight of proof. Then, one afternoon, Pat received a notice forwarded by her attorney. It was brief, official, and final. The investigation had found enough cause to open a formal case for attempted financial exploitation. Pat might be asked to testify again if charges moved forward. Pat sat at her kitchen table and stared at the paper for a long time. This was the moment people expect celebration. Pat felt something else. Grief. Not for the money. For the son she wished she had. For the years she spent thinking love meant paying. Pat folded the notice, placed it in the binder, and looked at the printed email again. "Stop asking for help. You're on your own." Kyle had written it to punish her. Now it sat in Pat's folder as the sentence that saved her. And Pat knew the next decision wasn't about Kyle. It was about what kind of life Pat would build after the storm. The first thing Pat rebuilt was not her finances. It was her mornings. After the hearing, Pat realized how much energy she had spent bracing for the next call, the next emergency, the next wave of guilt. With the court order in place and her account safeguards tightened, the silence became different. It wasn't abandonment. It was peace. Pat returned to her routine with intention. Yoga at dawn, not as escape, but as proof of strength. Coffee at the same table where the binder still sat. Now closed, now quiet, like a finished chapter. At the senior center, people noticed a change. Pat's friends didn't ask for the whole story. They didn't need it. They saw the way Pat held her shoulders, the way her eyes didn't flinch when her phone buzzed with normal messages. One afternoon, the program director asked Pat to help lead a new workshop. Staying safe with money. Pat almost said no. The subject felt too raw. Then Pat remembered the line Kyle used like a weapon. "You're vulnerable to scams." Pat understood now that the problem wasn't vulnerability. The problem was the way family can disguise exploitation as love. Pat agreed to lead the workshop with one condition. It would be practical, not preachy. Pat stood in a small room with folding chairs and a whiteboard. The group was a mix of retirees, some confident, some anxious, some embarrassed to be there. Pat didn't shame them. Pat told them the truth in a way that felt like respect. Pat brought 3 items to the front of the room: a printed spreadsheet, a bank receipt, a copy of a certified mail stub. "These are boring," Pat said, "and boring can save a life." Pat explained how to track transfers, how to set alerts, how to lower limits, how to require direct payment to institutions instead of person-to-person transfers. Pat explained that asking for documentation was not cruelty. It was clarity. Someone asked, "But what if it's your own child?" Pat paused, then answered slowly, "Then it matters even more," Pat said, "because love without boundaries becomes a pipeline." The room went quiet. People nodded. Some looked down. Pat saw recognition in their faces, the kind that hurts because it's true. In the weeks that followed, Pat met with Ms. Haynes again to finalize the partial irrevocable trust. The trust didn't erase Kyle. It simply placed Pat's future care behind a fence that Kyle couldn't climb. A portion of Pat's assets would be reserved for medical needs, housing stability, and long-term support if she ever needed it. Another portion remained flexible for Pat's life now: travel, gifts to friends, small joys, and the ability to say yes without fear. Pat also updated her will in a way that felt honest. Kyle was not erased, but Kyle's access was limited, conditional, and routed through structure. Not because Pat wanted to punish him, but because Pat refused to fund harm. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the city and the heat finally softened, Pat sat on her small patio with a glass of iced tea. A neighbor walked by and waved. A dog barked in the distance. The world kept moving. Pat looked at her phone. No missed calls from Kyle, no urgent texts, no fear. Pat thought about the last time Kyle had tried to control her with shame. "You weren't a perfect mom." Pat had carried that sentence like a weight for years, even before Kyle learned to weaponize it. Now Pat understood something simple. No parent is perfect, but no child is entitled to exploit imperfection. Pat's dignity did not depend on Kyle's approval. It depended on Pat's choices. In the months that followed, Pat became quietly known at the senior center as someone people could go to when something felt off. A neighbor's nephew asking for gift cards, a tech support caller demanding remote access, a grandchild texting from a new number with a story that didn't add up. Pat didn't act like a hero. Pat acted like a teacher. Pat asked questions. Pat wrote things down. Pat made people slow down long enough to see the pattern. And when Pat went home at night, Pat's condo felt like her own again. Not a resource to be mined, not a place to be invaded, not a stage for someone else's chaos. The binder stayed in a drawer now, but the lesson stayed in Pat's bones. Love does not require surrender. Concern does not require control. And a boundary is not the opposite of kindness. It is the shape that keeps kindness from being stolen. So here's the question that lingers after Pat's story. If someone you love gets angry when you ask for proof, what does that say about what they wanted from you? If this story hit close to home, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs it. And comment the city and state you're listening from, because every voice that speaks up makes it harder for exploitation to hide behind the word family.